Switzerland used to be perhaps the Las Vegas of banking. It was very secret. But you know what happens in Switzerland? Does it stay in Switzerland these days? We'll find out. Times are changing. The governments around the world want to tighten regulation on banking. Just last week, Switzerland reached an agreement with the United States to exchange bank account information on suspected tax dodgers. And today, a Florida millionaire pleaded guilty to filing a false tax return that failed to disclose assets held at UBS, the largest Swiss bank. Well, let's turn to Asher Rubenstein. He is a tax attorney at Rubenstein. And Rubenstein, welcome to Taking Stock. Good to have you with us.
Thank you.
And, you know, what is going on right now with Switzerland? I thought that the government had been negotiating with Switzerland for a very long time because of this actual UBS case having to do with secret bank accounts held in Switzerland.
Well, both statements are true, but they're really independent of one another. The IRS, via the Treasury Department, was prosecuting UBS both civilly and criminally in Florida. At the same time, you had the governments trying to reach an exchange of information agreement, which was apparently arrived at last week, although we don't have all the details and there are still some ambiguities about that agreement, but apparently an agreement has been reached.
All right. Now, if you can, I mean, you make it sound like there was almost like was there a parallel track here? I mean, because is it unusual for the IRS and the Treasury Department to go after a bank like UBS in a way, in such a public venue?
Absolutely. It was unusual and it was unprecedented. It's never really been done before. We're calling this really a perfect storm with respect to offshore banking, because it's not just UBS. HSBC is being investigated, and Credit Suisse is being investigated, and at the same time that the IRS is cracking down within the United States for Americans with offshore accounts, you have the OECD cracking down also along the same lines. You also have Senators Levin and Baucus and President Obama all proposing legislation that is significantly cracking down on tax havens and creating much more severe penalties for Americans who don't have compliant accounts offshore.
Now, when you talk about tax havens, now that's different. That's something about like trying to avoid taxes or doing something that is against the law. But there's a whole element to this which is just about disclosure, correct? Because there are certain types of situations in which an investor would want an offshore account to prevent possible civil action or garnishment of funds in some way. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I think you're 100% right, Pim. Nowhere is it illegal to have funds offshore. You or I can have an account in Switzerland, in Luxembourg, in Liechtenstein, in Singapore, wherever. It doesn't matter. What does matter is that you disclose that account. And there are two elements to that. There's filing the proper forms, letting the IRS know that you do have an account. And the second part is paying taxes on the gains and the growth within that account. If you do A and B, then you're okay. And in fact, going offshore for asset protection reasons makes complete sense. And it also allows you access to a worldwide array of investment vehicles that aren't accessible to U.S. taxpayers, but are accessible to offshore entities, which are legal, provided they're compliant.
Now, you make the point about this idea of paying taxes on investments that are held overseas. Now, the reason that's key is because a lot of countries, unlike the United States, permit their citizens to have overseas accounts, earn interest or earn investment income overseas. And that's not taxable, correct?
That is correct. Every country is different. The United States is one of the few countries in the world that have what's called a territorial, a global tax system. In other words, if I'm an American and I'm living in Japan, I pay tax on all my income earned in Japan. Now, I might be entitled to a credit for what I pay to the Japanese government against what I owe to the IRS, but the IRS will reach all my worldwide income.
And that accounts that also for what, investment income as well?
Yes.
And so Americans, in a sense, would be at a disadvantage to citizens of other countries.
That is correct. That's right.
All right. Well, we're going to continue the conversation with Asher Rubenstein. We're going to talk about these new tax laws. And also, as you said, if you do have an account overseas, there is a deadline looming. You better do something about it unless you want the IRS to start looking into your affairs. This is Taking Stock on Bloomberg. And a programming note, Taking Stock begins each weekday at 3 p.m. Eastern on WBBR 1130 AM in New York, XM Channel 129, Sirius Channel 130, and on Bloomberg.com.
the Federal Reserve was late to invoke those consumer protection powers. We have been very aggressive, as you know, for the past couple of years. I think it's very important, if the Fed retains those powers, that we strengthen the priority that those have in our decision-making, and that we have strengthened accountability, that we report frequently to Congress about what we're doing on these areas.
That was Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke speaking earlier today, acknowledging that the government was late to protect the consumer from some of the abuses on Wall Street. This is Taking Stock. I'm Pim Fox. I am here with Asher Rubenstein discussing, well, one form of regulation in the financial world. This has to do with accounts overseas. Asher, let's move now from talking just about Switzerland and the various regimes, tax regimes overseas. What about for U.S. taxpayers right now? There's a deadline looming, right, of June 20th. What do they have to do by June 20th?
It's by June 30th.
I beg your pardon, June 30th.
If you are an American taxpayer and you have signature authority or other means of control over a foreign account, you have to file what's called the FBAR. It's Treasury Department Form 90.22-1. It's available on the web, and it has to be received by the IRS by June 30th. It's different than most tax forms, which have to be mailed by a certain date. This one has to be received, so be sure to mail it a couple of days in advance of that. And on that form, you are to disclose where the account is, the account number, who signs on it, and other information like that.
Do they want to know how much is in the account?
Yes, but that's a separate issue. That goes to taxability. This is just the disclosure.
All right, and is there a limit in terms of the amount of money that has to be in the account for you to disclose that the account exists? I mean, do they want to know if you've got $10 in a foreign account?
No, not exactly. But if you have various accounts, more than one, and the total in the aggregate greater than $10,000 US dollars, then you have to list every single one of them on the FBAR form.
All right, so you've got to list all these accounts. And what are some of perhaps the ramifications if you don't? I mean, is this a huge penalty? I mean, let's say you forget to do this or you can't remember whether you had the account. How far back does this go?
Well, the FBAR that's due this June 30th is for calendar year 2008. If you haven't filed FBARs for accounts that you may have held in 07, 06, 05, the IRS recommends that you do it now with the filing for calendar year 2008.
And will there be any penalty if you haven't done it in the past?
It depends. At this point, you have to look at there are various categories of penalties. There are civil penalties, which are further divided into willful violations and non-willful violations.
All right, let's just assume everybody is good at what they do, and let's assume that they didn't do it intentionally.
Good, because then you raise the issue of criminal penalties, so let's not go there. But just staying with willful, I'm staying with non-willful civil, you're looking at a $10,000 fine. A
$10,000 fine if you don't do it?
Yes.
All right, that sounds like a very expensive piece of paper if you don't file it. I want to thank you very much, Asher Rubenstein, coming in from Rubenstein and Rubenstein, sharing your thoughts about tax reform, tax legislation that really has gone into effect, that affects everybody, and as well as U.S. investors overseas.